I hope you believe what you've just sung, that God is with us and that He's for us. I run onto people along the way who they're not really convinced God's with them, and they're surely not convinced God's for them. As a matter of fact, I think some almost feel like He's against them, that He's out to get them, that He's trying to punish them here on this earth in some way because of what they've said or done or whatever. And so I hope you understand this morning that God is with us and that He is for us. And this series that we're in called Starting Point, we've been exploring some of the key components for the starting point of faith. And I believe this is where we can build upon as we look to the future. And we've been asking questions like, where does faith begin? What does that look like? In week one, we asked you to ask a very basic, simple question of the Christian faith: who is Jesus? That's a question every single one of us need to answer for ourselves, and we need to know the truth. A lot of times I run onto folks who talk about, well, you know, the truth for me is this, and the truth for you may be something else, but we need to know the truth about who Jesus is. What does the Bible have to say about that? Last week we tried to help everybody establish a clear understanding of what sin is. The issue is we all have the same problem, and that is the fact that we are not mistakers. Our problem's bigger than that. We are, in fact, sinners. And we need to gain an understanding of our sinful condition, which causes us to approach things from an entirely different point of view than if we were just mistakers. I mean, if you missed out on that message or the message the week before, I would encourage you to visit The Point at Go to the Point online or go to thepoint.com. And there you can watch or listen and kind of catch up on what we've been talking about in this series as some of the key components of spiritual understanding and development, and we're systematically trying to put these things together to form a solid foundation for our faith. Now, if you miss a week or two and you go back and watch or listen, you'll have all the pieces in place because each week is uniquely important and very different in this series. And my hope is that when this series is done, that you could sit down with a friend who has no faith and you would be able to help them get started on their own faith journey. That'd be an awesome thing. And of course, for you to be able to help them on their faith journey, it's great if you are on your faith journey a little further down the road. And the good news is you only got to be about a step ahead to help somebody else down that path. Speaking about going online, we are in our First Steps class, which, by the way, if you aren't connected to a class on Wednesday night, that is a great place to start because we find out who we are and what we are about as a church. We're in room 120 down here on the east quarter, first door on the right. And in week number one, I just asked people to share, how they wound up at the Point. What brought you here? And several people, interestingly enough, brought up the fact that they'd done a Google search or they'd been online or they'd seen something on Facebook and they decided to come. And two people in the class actually mentioned reviews. Did you know that a review may alter somebody's decision about whether or not to come to church? And a Google review, so, they see a 5-star rating or maybe something on Facebook. That's a great way to kind of give a testimony about how the Lord has used the church in your life. And I thought, we've never really advocated it, but I thought today might be a good day to just say, hey, if you're on Facebook, and I'm not advocating you get on it, but if you're on it already, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to like The Point and consider giving a review. I would recommend a 5-star review. That's my thought. You may want to do something else. If your thought is a 3 or a 2 or a 1, let's just skip over this portion of the message and pretend like it never even happened. But my point is, there's a lot of folks that are going to make a decision about going to church based off of a review like that. And so I would encourage you to, even if you've never reviewed anything, to consider doing that maybe today as you have opportunity, because it really could make a difference in the life of somebody else as they're thinking about their own faith journey, getting plugged into a church, making that connection. And today we're going to talk about the starting point, not just for your personal faith, but we're going to talk about the starting point for everyone in general. Not only is there a starting point for our faith journey personally, but there's a general starting point to the faith story as a whole. It might interest you to know that the major faith traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, claim a very similar starting point wrapped up in the name of a person by the name of Abraham. All three of them believed that there was a God who created the heavens and the earth. They believed that God created a perfect world. All three would believe that Adam was the first created being, and the sin of Adam and the human beings that followed him are what messed up this perfect world that God had made. And then God started his cleanup operation with one man by the name of Abraham, and that's who we're going to talk about today. God made a lot of promises to Abraham, and Abraham's response to those promises didn't just have implications for his own personal starting point or the starting points of Christianity. It had implications for your starting point as well. Now, we know that the Bible tells us that we're all sinners. That's how we messed up God's perfect world. It was because of sin. And we talked about sin last week. Sin being a willful transgression of God's known law. And so when we know what we're doing is wrong and we choose to do it anyway, that's sin. It's important that we make this distinction because Romans tells us that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Now, you might not like the idea of admitting that you're a sinner, but you probably know it's true. You can identify, you can relate. In fact, mankind's first sin was an act of disobedience. We know that according to Scripture, mankind's first sin was an act of disobedience. And, Adam and Eve were told, don't eat from every tree in the garden. You can eat from every tree, but don't eat from this one tree. That's it. There was one tree that was singled out. Don't eat from that tree, and you're going to be fine. And what did they do? They ate from that tree. They made a decision that would result in a curse on the world that lasts to this very day. Now, we don't have time to get into all the consequences about that choice they made, but everything from sickness to death to disease to shame to weeds in your garden to pain in childbirth, those are all just some of the consequences of the choice that they made. We call that episode, when they made that decision to turn their back and disobey God, we call that event the fall of man. Because in that single act of disobedience, Adam brought a curse on the entire human race. We can be thankful, though, that God has provided a way for us to be saved from the eternal consequences of sin, but the truth is the temporary consequences of sin remain. We deal with those every day in a variety of ways. I think it'd be fair for us to say we live in a world that is stained by sin. You have seen evidence of that probably this week, maybe even in your own life. Maybe you saw it on the news or read it in the newspaper. Maybe it was something that an encounter that you had with another person, or something you became aware of, or maybe something you did. But we live in a world that is stained by sin. Now, the world we're living in is not the world that God intended. I think it's important that we note that. Sin came as a result of one man's freedom to choose. And I can just hear somebody say, oh, that's just not fair. That's not fair. One guy made a decision, we're all suffering. That's right. And in case you haven't been aware of it up to this point, I'm going to let you in on some bad news. Life's not fair. Yeah, can anybody relate to that? Life's just not fair. That's the truth. And sin, it has this ripple effect. It doesn't just affect me, it affects the people around me. You cannot sin in a vacuum, because sin has a way of impacting other people, and we've all seen somebody else get hurt by the sin of somebody else. And it's because sin is so devastating. It is so devastating, it can affect us all. The fall affected us all. And so Adam's choice resulted in a curse that's upon mankind, and while most of us are quick to judge Adam and Eve based on our own history, I'm convinced that the condition of the world probably wouldn't be a lot different if you or I had been in the garden that day. Now, maybe you've never thought about that, and I may be wrong, but I have a feeling based on the condition of mankind that if you or I had been in the garden, we'd be, blaming somebody else. I won't even use anybody's name as an example because I'll risk offending somebody. It wouldn't be Adam and Eve that we would be thinking of, though. We would be thinking of somebody else, because what happened was they were given the freedom to choose, and here's the thing, with the freedom to choose right comes the distinct possibility of choosing wrong. And that's exactly what Adam did. And that's what you've done. And that's what I've done somewhere along the way. We had the opportunity to choose right, and we chose wrong. That's why the Bible says we have all sinned. There are no exceptions. So these different faith traditions all believe that God created this perfect world. God created man. Man's sin corrupted the entire perfect world that God had made. And then the fourth common denominator in all three of these faith traditions is Abraham. Abraham's this guy that lived about 4,000 years ago, and in the book of Genesis, we see God beginning to have an interaction with Abraham. God set out to correct the ills of the world and repair what was destroyed by man, what was destroyed by sin, and God decided to use this guy named Abraham to begin that process. And so it's fair to say that Abraham is a very pivotal character in the history of the world. God's goal was to resolve this problem of sin, this problem of disobedience, this problem of corruption in the world. And so today we're going to listen in on a conversation that God had with this man named Abraham. This conversation is going to help clear up maybe some of the questions that all of us have asked along the way. Questions like, where do I stand with God? Does God hear my prayers? Does God care about me? Can I truly know God? Can I have peace with God? You need to understand, our world because of sin was a mess. And we had a mess that was so big we couldn't clean it up on our own. Have you ever been in a mess like that? We needed God's help. We're kind of like this 3-year-old boy that dropped a bowl of cereal. That's not hard to make that mess when you're 3. But that's a tough mess to clean up when you're 3. Wouldn't you say? I mean, there's going to be cereal under the cabinet, and there's going to be milk still on the floor, and there's probably going to be a broken bowl along the way. That's a mess. Making a mess is easy, and, that's not the big thing. Mankind, though, had made a mess. Mankind had made a mess, and it was not a mistake, it was a decision. Our mess was the result of sin, willful disobedience. The world was polluted with sin. The world was polluted with injustice. The world was polluted with wickedness. It was all commonplace, and sin had taken hold of humanity. And God saw the mess we had made. He saw what was happening, and He knew that this mess was too big for us to clean up on our own. He knew we couldn't do it ourselves. There was no way we could take care of it on our own. So being the loving, gracious, compassionate God that He is, God had a decision to make. Would He choose to turn His back and walk away from our mess, or would He address the mess? Would God help us clean up our mess? He chose Abraham as the starting point for fixing the mess that humanity made. He began there, and here's what He said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. The Lord said, Abram at that time, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. See, when God changed a person's name, Abram was later to be Abraham. When God changed a person's name and gave him a new name, it was usually to establish a new identity. God would change Abram's name, which means high father, to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. God said, Abram, I want you to leave your family, say goodbye to your entire support system. You're going to leave your circle of influence, because God was preparing to do something that was going to impact the whole world. And then God made Abram, 3 promises that I want you to look at with me today. Promise number 1, God promised in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. See, the promise made by God to Abraham almost 4,000 years ago absolutely came true. I will make you into a great nation. See, God was about to address the problem of sin, disobedience, and corruption, and He says, I'm going to make you a great nation, but you can't become a great nation until first you become a family. At this point, it's just 2 people. It's Abraham and Sarah, his wife. And when they were gone, game over. So this promise that God was making to Abraham implies there's going to be a child. which means, this promise won't be fulfilled overnight. It's going to take a little while. But God chose Abraham, and he says, one day, someday, Abraham, you will be a great nation. I'm going to build a great nation through you. Listen to what else he promises. Promise number 2, same verse, Genesis 12:2. He says, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I have a feeling probably everybody in this room has heard the name Abraham. You know about Father Abraham. And I want you to think about this. Here we are, halfway around the world, 4,000 years after the fact. We speak a different language in a different culture, and everybody knows about Abraham. I think we could put a check mark there and say, promise kept. In fact, I want this on the screen because I want you to remember it, because somebody here needs to know God always keeps his promises. I don't want to say sometimes, most of the time. God always keeps his promise. And maybe you need to be reminded of that apart from everything else that's going to be said this morning. You need to be reminded God always keeps his promise. Promise number 3 that he gave to Abram at the time, he says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. See, all peoples, not all the people as in individuals, but all the peoples, meaning all the people groups, are somehow going to be blessed and better off because of Abraham. Now, God always keeps his promise. That's what God has promised to Abraham. And here's where things start really getting interesting, because God made this promise when Abraham was an old man. He made this promise when Abraham had no children. And so when Abraham dies, everything he owns is going to go to this guy named Eliezer, who's Abraham's chief servant. That's just how it works. I mean, what else are you going to do? Abraham had no descendants. And so Eliezer would be the one to receive the inheritance. But God said everybody on the earth was going to know Abraham's name, and everybody on the earth was going to be blessed through him. And that can't happen with Eliezer. There's got to be a son. Abraham needs some descendants. And so he's out praying one night, and in Genesis chapter 4, look what it says. Genesis 15, verse 4. The word of the Lord came to Abram. This man, talking about Eliezer, will not be your heir. But look at this, a son coming from your own body will be your heir. In other words, don't worry, Abram. You're going to be Abraham. You're going to have a flesh and blood heir. You just wait and see. Let's look at verse 5. God took him outside, said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Verse 6, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Picture it, if you would, this huge Middle Eastern sky that stretches from horizon to horizon. There's no way that Abraham's going to be able to count all the stars in that sky. And it's like God is saying, Abraham, I know you don't have a son. I know you don't have an heir, but I want you to trust me on this, Abraham. I want you to trust me on this. You are going to become a great nation. There will be more people who will come from you than you'll ever know and that would ever be counted. And then something amazing happens. It's just a statement, and it's just incredibly profound, and it has amazing implications for every single one of us, even to this day, because in this statement, God reveals the nature of the relationship that he wants to have between God and man. He defines the terms of the relationship between God and man, and he answers a question we've all asked in our own way at some point along the way. Can anyone know for sure where they stand with God? See, even though all the major traditions of faith come together around this single man, this is also where it all kind of begins to go in its own separate ways, because this is so unbelievably true. It sounds too good to be true, but it says Abraham believed the Lord there in verse 6, and God credited it to him as righteousness. I don't want you to miss this. Abraham believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. It's like Abraham said, even though I have no children, God, and even though I'm an old man, and even though my wife is getting up there in years, I believe. I trust you. God, I believe. I'm going to trust the words that you have spoken to me today. And it was in that moment, in that expression of faith, in that expression of trust and confidence, in this amazing single solitary expression of faith, God said to Abraham, I am giving you the gift of right standing with me. It's as if God said, Abraham, I accept you because you believed me and you trusted me. Abram believed the Lord and God credited it to him as righteousness. In that moment, he was considered as righteous. Another way of saying it is trust in God resulted in a right standing with God. See, we can all have a right standing with God. It happens as a result of faith and trust in Him. Now, so often people struggle with this and they say, it sounds too good to be true. So they try to connect it with something that they do so that they can earn it. And it has to be, there's got to be more to it than that. And they think right standing with God comes as a result of their own good works, or it must be about inheritance. In fact, some of the time people, when Jesus lived 2,000 years after Abraham, the Jews even said to Jesus, we don't need you. We're the sons and daughters of Abraham. You remember that? It's enough to be the child of Abraham, or so they thought. It's about who you're related to. And it's like people always try to put their own spin on it. We always have a tendency to try to add to what God's already said. We try to make it palatable and we try to understand it. So the question is, how do you know when God says you're approved? How do you know when God says you're in? How do you know when God says all is well? How do you know when you've done enough? How do you know when you've believed enough? And is it even possible to know? And if so, how do you know? Is it about birth or behavior or belief or a combination? 4,000 years ago, God revealed to Abraham the truth. And it's almost impossible for us to comprehend that the Most High God would make the standard, think about this, so incredibly simple. But He placed the bottom rung of the ladder so low that anybody can reach it. Anybody can reach it. And He did it because He saw the mess that we were in. He saw the mess that we had made. It was a mess that we were born into, and we've been adding to the mess ourselves. The mess of our own making was a mess brought on by disobedience and sin. We had complicated our own lives. We knew we were making a mess, and that's why we were reluctant to call on God to help us, because we thought, man, surely would He even want to help? Would He care? And God made it clear that the key, the way that you enter into a relationship with Him where we can all be righteous and approved, is not through who we're related to, and it's not through your behavior. God made it so simple. He made it so clear. It is a matter of faith and trust in Him. And so here's the question. What if the starting point for a relationship with God is really as simple as trust? What if that's it? I mean, you don't have to have all the answers. It's just a decision to trust, to take God at His word. And the reason that may be hard for some people to believe is because of the way you've been raised, or what you've been told from people like me, or it may be because of what you've read, or because of what's been laid on to you, you've picked up along the way. Think about it. There's no other place in the world where you can be unconditionally loved and accepted based simply on trust. There's no other place that you can be loved unconditionally based simply on the fact that we have trust. It does not happen at school. It does not happen where you work. It doesn't happen in our families, though I wish it did. And sadly, for many, it hasn't even happened at church. And yet God said, Abraham, I declare you righteous because you trusted in me. What if the starting point for our relationship with God really is that simple? What if it's all about faith and trust? I want you to answer a question. Which statement represents your view of faith and trust? Check off one of these options. God accepts me based on my birth. God accepts me based on my behavior. God accepts me based on my belief, or a combination of those three. I want you to think about that. And I want you to take that question, those questions with you, and ponder them this week. Where does that fit in? God accepts me based on my belief, or is it birth, or is it behavior, or is it a combination? It's easy to embrace the idea that, the starting point for faith is based on my behavior because I'll learn it. Is it easy for you to embrace the idea that maybe the starting point for your relationship with God is as simple as faith? Or subtly, does it need to be faith plus something else? Something you've done, something you've earned. I would love it if you would get together with somebody this week and talk about which one of those models of faith you grew up with. Which one makes most sense to you? Which feels most comfortable to you? Which of those models have you either intentionally or unintentionally followed for the majority of your life? And what does God reveal to you about that today? And we're going to pick it up right there next week. But before we get to next week, if you've not already done so, I want to encourage you to take a step of faith today. And I want to encourage you to get with somebody to process some of these questions. You can hear this, you can walk out of here and do nothing about it. It's so possible that nothing changes in your life simply because you've heard a message. The challenge is for us to take it to the next level, spiritually speaking, which means we talk about it, we process it, and we do something about it. And so much of the time for that to happen, what we need is accountability. We need somebody else to take the journey with us. We need to have somebody else look us in the eye and ask us those questions, and we need to answer them honestly. See, we've not been called to travel through life alone. That's why a part of our weekly 3 is to worship, connect, and serve. We need to connect with one another. And so I would encourage you to grab a message application guide out at the Welcome Center today or pick one up online at gotothepoint.com. Ask the questions. Discuss your personal starting point and help others find out how they too can get started on a journey of faith. I'd like to pray to that end. Would you bow with me, please, as we pray? Father, if there would be somebody here today who would say, you know what, I got to say, I haven't really made that step. I've never really taken a step of faith. I've never really placed my trust in God. Would you help them to take that step today? You've taught us that right standing with you comes through faith alone. Would you pull back the veil in our own hearts and minds against the odds of all we've heard and seen and experienced up to this point? Would you help us to accept that as truth from your word? My prayer for every single person hearing this message is that you would increase our faith. Give us the faith and courage to call out to you, the one who loves us so very much. And give us faith to trust what you say. Father, thank you for keeping the rung of the ladder so low. Nobody has to be left out. We thank you for that reality today. In Jesus' name.